Hi, I'm Doris Epstein, and this is MENSCHlife TV. The vendetta against Israel and the Jewish people goes on, with more and more bigotry, more and more irrationality, and outright lies. Today, we're going to look at anti-Semitism in Canada with our guests and welcome Rochelle Wilner, past president of B'nai Brith Canada, and Anita Bromberg, National Director of Legal Affairs, B'nai Brith Canada. The first thing that I want to open with is the most recent and the most shocking because it happened as part of our Toronto District School Board. The East End Madrasa rents space for its weekend religious programs from a high school that they rent from the Toronto District School Board. They were found to be using textbooks that refer, and I'm quoting, to crafty, treacherous Jews. They compared the beliefs of Jews with Nazis. Boys were told to keep fit so that they can be ready for violent jihad. And anti-Jewish teachings were found on their website. After finding this anti-Semitic material online, Jewish groups filed complaints with the Toronto School Board, and the police are investigating. Would you comment on this, Anita?
Well, my comment is that if anybody thinks this is an isolated incident that's solved by removing it from the website, by having the principal or head of the affiliated mosque denounce it, then they're missing the point. We released shortly thereafter another press release urging broad investigation into what's going on. We've seen these kinds of examples popping up now and again, and just a quick search on the internet found an article about teaching kids that celebrating families as well, by that matter, celebrating Canada Day, commemorating Remembrance Day would be contrary to Sharia, to Islamic law. Can you think?
And this was online.
Mm-hmm. This was out of BC. So as just an example, it's not an isolated incident, and it's to our peril if we don't take this in a broader context.
That the Jewish community has taken arms, has taken action, and launched an investigation with the police.
It's not the first time. I think it's the first time that it's gotten the publicity that it has. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, a mosque was renting space from a public school in Toronto on Saturdays, and they were having classes for their children. And part of the agreement with the Board of Education, the Toronto District School Board, was that they not leave any materials behind, that when they leave, whatever they produce goes with them. And one morning, Anita might remember this, we had a phone call from the school. They were distraught because they left their artwork hanging on the walls of the school, and the artwork had the kids were painting pictures about jihad. So this is not...
And this was an afternoon school.
This
here
was a
Toronto.
weekend school here in
school.
Toronto. Now this is 7 or 8 years ago, so it hasn't gone away. We're probably not aware of all of the incidents between then and now, but as Anita said, we are putting ourselves at peril if we pretend that this is an isolated incident. It's not.
You mentioned something earlier about a site on the Canadian Muslim site organization.
The Calgary the Calgary Muslim, is it the Calgary Muslim Association Council? And I mean, they have a column on their website, Ask the Imam. And when they write in and ask the Imam how they should raise their children in Canada, the answer is, and if you would like, I could probably find the quote for that, because the answer is not something that we want to be hearing here in Canada. Now, I understand that since people found out and started to complain, they have taken it off the website, but it has been captured and it is available for anybody who wants to see it. I will find it.
Just the gist of it. The gist of it.
The gist of it is not to be Canadian. That you mustn't accept Canadian values, that you must be prepared for jihad, you must prepare yourself for a Sharia lifestyle.
What does that mean, not accepting Canadian values? What does that,
how
does that
I
break
think,
down?
As I put it when we were talking to some reporters about our most recent press release, citing as an example the BC website, it's a very different approach to what the Jewish community took in their establishment as a community in Canada. We've always celebrated Canada. We've always sought to be part of it. Yes, we've sought some accommodation so that we can recognize our Jewish heritage and practice our religion, but celebrating Canadian values and being part of Canada is and was always a part of what the Jewish community
Doris,
was.
one of the quotes on this website is, and I'm quoting directly, "You should instill a hatred for this culture and its ways in the hearts of your children."
All right, we'll come back with more about what's out there, and it's not just bits and pieces. There's a lot more that we have not addressed or even brought to light in a minute. We're looking at anti-Semitism in Canada with guests Anita Bromberg and Rochelle Wilner, and I want you to repeat that quote that you found and where it comes from.
The quote comes from a site from the Muslim Council of Calgary, and they have a column called Ask the Imam. And the question put to the imam was how to raise your children in a Western country like Canada. And part of the response includes this quote: "You should instill a hatred for this culture and its ways in the hearts of your children." Now, what could be more anti-Canadian than that ideology?
So what you're finding is not just anti-Jewish rhetoric, but also anti-Canadian, anti the values that we run this country by.
Exactly, which makes it a problem for all Canadians.
But if it's out there, how come we're not finding it?
Well,
doing something about it?
Well, the answer is we are finding piece by piece but we're not always getting the response that we want. For instance, I go back to the BC website that I mentioned. The man that the website claims that it's supervised by a imam, now he's calling himself a sheikh, that we complained to about, I believe it was back in 2004, because his own community were complaining about website lectures in Arabic calling Jews and I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but the gist of it, calling Jews the sons of, the descendants of pigs and monkeys and so forth. And there was a complaint to the police. And 2004, fast forward, that complaint never went anywhere. There weren't, it's a good question. Is it a lack of will? Lack of tools?
A lack of political will?
I don't know. I don't know the answer in that particular case, where and why it happened. But let's fast forward to another case. Last year, or 2000, I believe it was last year, the OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, finally, after many years of investigating a then York University student who was hosting a website called Filthy Jewish Terrorists, you might recall this story, and there were concerns about the website. It was brought to their attention. It was decided that he had made amends and he had voluntarily consented to undergo some treatment and would take down the website and so forth. Sure enough, that wasn't followed through. The website went back up, and finally the police decided, and the Attorney General approved hate crime charges. The charges were laid, but now he disappeared from Canada.
So what you're saying is that we have evidence We know it's there in Islamic institutions, in other areas, but we're not following up.
The dots are all there, and if you connect the dots, you'll find a pattern that is becoming historic. This, you know, when we read in the papers that this is the first time, no, it's the first time it's exposed that way. I mean, I'll go back to the Mosquiteria as an example.
Tell us about the Mosquiteria.
You know, there's a school in the Toronto District School Board, Valley View or Valley Park Middle School. It has about 1,200 students in the school, and 2/3 of them are Muslim. And they were finding that when the students were going to the mosque on Friday afternoon from November to March for whatever prayers have to be said on Friday afternoon, many of them weren't returning. They were skipping school. So to accommodate the students, the principal of the school agreed that the cafeteria could be used for a mosque on Friday afternoons. And they were bringing an imam in to lead the services for these children. Now the cafeteria was closed to all other children. Girls had to sit behind the boys. There was a lot of gender separation that was now being condoned by the principal of the school. And all of this was done under the guise of fair accommodation or reasonable accommodation, according to the principal
So they turned the
and the school
cafeteria
trustee
into
a mosque.
During
Now,
Fridays.
And given the timing, it was class time. Their times of prayers vary, so that at this particular time, it falls outside of school time. But at certain points of the year, the prayer time falls during instructional time.
Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem for a number of reasons, but primarily because we have an Ontario Education Act that stipulates that religious prayer is not allowed during school time. You can teach about religion, so you can teach the children about all religions, but we don't indoctrinate in any religion. So by allowing this religion to be part of the curriculum during school time, it's giving
and take precedence over classes.
It's giving one religion priority over all others. Now we know that the Lord's Prayer has been taken out of the school. We know that many schools no longer have Christmas trees. We know that schools aren't allowed to have Christmas concerts because it's offensive to others. But we're making accommodation for minority groups that aren't being made for all minority groups.
Okay, we'll come back in just a minute with the boycott, the United Church boycott that has just been announced. Anti-Semitism in Canada, anti-Israelism in Canada. The United Church issued a report recently that called for a boycott of products from Israeli settlements. They also said that the deepest meaning of the Holocaust was the loss of dignity for Jews. It's two separate issues, but it comes to, there's a unity here. And this was followed by a statement saying Palestinians also suffer a loss of dignity under Israeli occupation. And this is what the past moderator of the United Church of Canada, Reverend David Giuliano, wrote. His report makes a clear distinction between Israel and the Israeli settlements. It takes seriously that there is a military occupation, the longest such occupation in living memory, and many of the United Church have seen it firsthand and know it to be harsh and oppressive. Therefore, they have decided to boycott all goods from the settlements, from the West Bank. What's your reaction?
My reaction is that they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. And I'll try to explain why. When it's obvious that the people who did the research for this document and the authors of the document really haven't studied history. Because when they talk about the Palestinian dignity and they talk about recognizing the Palestinians because of their history, I have to say to them, what is their history? Who were they before 1967? When Israel was created by the United Nations in 1948, who were the Palestinians? Who were the Aboriginals of the Middle East? The Jews were considered to be the inherent Palestinians.
And yet again, with this focus on dignity, they are endorsing the right of return for all Palestinians.
Well, look, when we looked at that...
At the other hand, at the same time, ensuring that Israel's security be respected and the boundaries be respected.
You know what? What's missing from that is understanding the dynamics of the Middle East and what's going on in Israel. And if they missed the key point, and they purposely missed the key point, and that is that the barriers are up, that Israel is continuing to struggle for its survival because of terrorism, because of an unwillingness to recognize it as a democratic Jewish state that has the right to exist in the region. And it goes back to the kinds of rhetoric that we're worried is popping up in the
And
school.
they're using the green line as a boundary.
Well, and who said that that's the right line? You know, that's
That was
supposed
the
to be...
armistice line, wasn't
and
it?
it was an arbitrary line that was drawn on a map at a point in time. It was never meant to be a permanent separation. But Anita, I think that they did pay token comment to the fact, right? They paid token comment to the issue of terror, but they don't acknowledge the fact that the dignity of the Palestinians, when they talk about the dignity of today's Palestinians, of Arafat's Palestinians, when they talk about their dignity, they talk about how undignified it is to have to go through checkpoints and how undignified it is to have border security. On the one hand, they want their own state. On the other hand, they want complete, open, and free access to Israel. Well, which is it? We don't have open and free access to our neighbor who happens to be a friend and not threatening us with the terror attacks and bombings every day. We can't simply cross the border without going through a border patrol. We go through a checkpoint.
Or on that vein, they're calling for the barrier walls, or however they termed it, to come down.
But how many other countries are building barrier walls? Why aren't they complaining about the barrier wall that Egypt built between themselves and these people? So it's very selective criticism. Why are they focusing on Israel? Why aren't they focusing on some of the horrible atrocities that are going on in this world? Why is this church focusing on Israel?
There was a recent report out of the Palestinian communities noting that the atrocities in the Arab world are taking away from this issue of the Palestinian issue, but I think it shouldn't be seen as taking it away. These are important issues that have to be resolved because Israel has the right to live in security and has to have peace around it with whatever states are existing in order for it to secure its aims. You know, I hadn't been in Israel for many years, and about 2 years ago went back. And it struck me when I took I had lived in so-called West Bank, and now going back, I got the occasion to go to Rachel's tomb. And this is where I think the report has got it wrong, because they're looking at it from a single angle, from a single lens, and not looking at the bigger
picture.
The bigger picture. When I went to Rachel's tomb, I was overwhelmed with the thought, who's living behind the wall? 30 years ago, when I had occasion to live on the West Bank, and yes, there were problems, of course, but the barriers weren't up the way they are now. And there was free exchange, and their neighbors were sharing, and so forth and so on. Now I come to Israel, and I go to the Rachel's tomb, and to get into Rachel's tomb, I don't know if you've had occasion, but it's like you have to be guarded in, you have to be guarded out, and you're in a prison-feeling environment because that's the only way you can be protected. who's living behind the barriers? I think the majority of Israelis hate the barriers. They don't want it there, but it's a reality. If you look at the fact that there's been relative peace in terms of suicide bombings for how many years since the last major one, the barriers are a success. But it has a negative impact on everybody. It's not the way that Israelis would want to live.
So this is what they're calling harsh, the occupation, the harshness.
But they're ignoring the dignity that is taken away from the Israelis. Whenever they go into a supermarket, they have to be body scanned and have their purses checked. When children go to a movie theater, they have to have their bodies checked and they have to expose everything in their pockets and handbags. Whose dignity is really at risk here?
More about anti-Semitism in Canada, anti-Israelism in just a minute. We're going back to the first issue we started with, which is the madrasa issue. And the fact that they've made by the way, the principal, I asked the principal to come on the show several times. I emailed him and he ignored me. How was that resolved? They've offered an apology. They've taken their stuff off the web, their anti-Jewish material, but they've offered an apology to the Jewish community.
Well, I'm not sure that it could be called an apology. There was a 19-minute speech that was available on YouTube that I listened to, and I have to say I waited to hear the words, "We apologize for what we were doing." I heard a lot of, we used the wrong language, our words weren't appropriate. It was like the child who was caught with his hands in the cookie jar after being told they couldn't have a cookie. So they were trying to make amends, but there was no real apology that I could hear. It was all this, we just chose the wrong words. I'm not convinced that they're sorry. They knew better. I also heard or read that they weren't aware of the extent of the hatred in their teachings.
Anita, your reaction?
I agree with Rochelle. The bits that I listened to, the National Post story on it, it leaves me really wondering. It's not the first time that we've not been satisfied at B'nai Brith with an apology, with words that don't get to the root of the problem. Pulling the stuff off the website that particular website is just a small problem. Maybe they just realized that they shouldn't have put it on the web. That doesn't mean that it's taken out of the classroom. Have they had a information session with the students, explaining to them that if they've read and studied that it was most inappropriate? You know, when there's an incident in the school, we always advise the schools to bring all the students together and have a debriefing session. Did that take place? I certainly didn't hear about that. There's other stuff that's on the related websites that's concerned. For instance, the book that is the source apparently for this Dinyat, and excuse my pronunciation, curriculum, is still linked in the parent website's list of resources.
It's still there.
It was there when I last looked at the issue.
And published by an Iranian foundation.
So it's been,
it's
said, yes.
And I guess the bigger
The
question.
FBI corroborated that.
Yes.
Well, there were two sources. One, both Iranian-based, as I understand it. One, the brief biography of the Prophet dealt with. It had a section about the Jews and their part in fighting the Prophet Muhammad, and that's where the part came in.
But this begs a bigger question. How many students have graduated from that school who have been taught this same hatred?
There's 4 schools that they run.
How many of their graduates have graduated having learned this, and how many are they going to bring back to debrief, as you suggested? How much of this hatred is so instilled in their culture that it's just part of who they are and what they are?
And how do we know what's going on in other Islamic institutions?
We don't. And you know, when you start delving it, a part of that same curriculum that is now brought up, and by the way, look at the age group that it was aimed at. This wasn't a
What
sophisticated group of university students that could analyze. These were these were children. Part of that curriculum that I managed to capture on the website had also a rewrite of Middle East history. It speaks of pure propaganda from my point of view. Such as Israel attacked the Palestinians and forced them into a war in 1948. Let's get our history straight. You want to talk about problems and say now that you're going to reach out and have a dialogue, and that you're part of interfaith efforts, then let's start with understanding that if you want to have an interfaith dialogue, not only do you have to get rid of the hate, you also have to get rid of what might be related to it, because one leads to the other. And that's the kind of propaganda that is part of a history retelling.
Here's one solution about the schools, Islamic institutions, to get a task force to investigate. That means people have to learn or know Arabic and Urdu. Is that realistic?
Well, they also have to be allowed in.
What do you mean?
They would have to be allowed in to monitor some of the classes, to look at the materials. There would have to be external reviews of what is being taught in the schools.
You see, now what's happening is the Toronto District School Board has temporarily, we just heard this in the last 24 hours, pulled the permit that allowed this school to, this program to operate in the Toronto District School Board's facilities. So pending the hate crime investigation, they pulled the permit. Okay. What does that mean? Well, we're getting towards the end of this year. They'll re-examine the issue come September. But let's say they can't make whatever definitions of policy that the school board has, and we can get to that I have some concerns there. But what's going to happen? Let's say
there's no policy in place, is what you're saying.
I worry about the definitions that will be in the policy. For example, we were talking off camera a bit about what's going to happen with the Pride Parade once again, and the anti-Israel groups that are going to be allowed apparently to march.
The Queers Against Israel Apartheid.
And why? Because it doesn't fit the definition of hate that the city is using. So fast forward to the Toronto District School Board. Can we expect maybe a different outcome? It all comes down to the definitions. And if you're talking for an overview...
I think that's a good place to begin again, with definitions, with naming names, which people are loath to do. The media is loath to say Muslim, is loath to say Islam. Why is that? And is there a political will to change things, such as policy that you were referring to, Anita? Back in a minute. We thought we were finished with them last summer. Queers Against Israel Apartheid, as part of the gay parade, which is funded by the City of Toronto. After a lot of discussion and meetings and protests, and they went out because they didn't think they'd get the funds, but they're back again yet. Okay, last year the mayor said taxpayers' dollars should not go to fund hatred. But in June, the city council said these people do not constitute a hate group. Your comment, Anita.
Well, they're saying that it doesn't constitute a hate group under their definition. My answer is, so change the definition because you got it wrong. Simple as that. And connecting it to what we're talking about, if the Toronto District School Board should review their policy and find that this doesn't match their policy, then the answer is not then it's okay, it's something's wrong with the policy. We if it's a duck and it smells like a duck and it quacks like a duck, we know what it is. We've got to stop fooling ourselves about this stuff. Now,
and given the need for change in policy that you just mentioned, if we don't do that, every time there's an issue, every time there's a problem, every time anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, then we treat it as a symptom. We don't treat the whole thing.
I think there's been enough declarations from various municipalities in and around Toronto and elsewhere. We even saw it in the United Church document, the couple of gems that are in there. They acknowledge that Israel is not an apartheid state. It's been condemned. Israel
that in itself is a hate statement and a lie.
Absolutely.
It's been condemned.
It stands alone.
It's been condemned by Toronto, by Markham, by various municipalities, by our leaders as a hate-related piece of propaganda.
And yet they have to define that it doesn't come within the jurisdiction of what hatred is?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about apartheid and the terminology, because it begs the question, why under the aegis of so many universities in North America have these Israel Apartheid Weeks been allowed to flourish? My question to all of the clever people who are running these universities and these intellectual institutions is at what point does freedom of speech intersect with truth and reality? At what point do you have to say to yourself, we are being dishonest by allowing this lie to be perpetrated on our campuses? Because Israel is not either legally or socially an apartheid state. And so when major institutions give credence...
This continues.
Political,
and every year
it's driven by political correctness.
Actually, my hunch is that they're going to have to find another slogan. They tried Zionism is racism. That didn't work for too long. They tried this apartheid, and it caught on for a little while, but I think it's been denounced in enough circles that, and we've seen in some, at least on some campuses, that it's not as strong an exercise as it used to be.
We wait for things to diminish. Don't we have?
But
do we have enough teeth in our hate laws? Do we have enough teeth to close things down and catch it at the beginning?
Now we're talking about the will of those who are entrusted to enforce these laws. But I think, Anita, that yes, the terminology might change, but the the underlying, so it won't be Israel apartheid, it won't be Zionism is racism. The slogans might change, but what produces these slogans and what gives rise to new slogans, the hate for Jews and for Israel, has not changed and is not, I don't see that it's changing. It's flourishing in a world that is looking at Israel as the scapegoat for the world's problems. And history has a way of repeating itself, and I don't want to be doom and gloom, but if we look at history and if we look at what's happening in the global picture, this isn't history repeating itself in Europe. This is history beginning to repeat itself, or well into repeating itself, in a far more global sense, because the world is involved in this hatred.
So what's happening
Israel.
In Canada is a reflection of what's going on in the world, more or less.
We can look at stats, we can find the comparisons, the differences,
but we have
the trends
to
are
combat
there.
that. We have a government that has never been more pro-Israel than what we have now. How come this is going on?
Because anti-Semitism is a virus that is as old as civilization, and it's there. It exists.
Our Prime Minister and his government is very pro-Israel, probably the most pro-Israel government this country has ever had, and likely one of the most pro-Israel governments any democratic country has ever had. But that's at a national level, and that's for national policy. Our Prime Minister cannot get into the hearts and minds of the individuals within our country. So we have people who have this inherent hatred for Jews and have no difficulty, calling Jews the descendants of apes and pigs. There's a disconnect between what government can do on the one hand and what plays itself out on the street on the other hand. It would take a community effort, a grassroots effort to begin to mobilize enough people to counter this. We have to be vigilant. We have to report things that we see. And once reported, we have to have mechanisms in place that will deal with it, that won't be intimidated by the political correctness or lack of political correctness in dealing with the problems that we're facing. That's a huge problem as far as I can see.
And I think that when an incident happens of anti-Semitism, the mistake is to accept a simple apology that may not really be an apology, and not look at the bigger picture, to hold leadership to task to follow through. It's one thing to say that, you know, the political leaders have spoken out about it, but, you know, we focused a bit on some of the recent incidents of hate-related activity that centered in an Islamic school. I don't doubt for very long, I don't doubt for a moment that there are a lot of people in the school community there that are horrified that this is what has happened. But they have to be able to speak out against the leaders or whoever was responsible for putting that stuff on. The hatred that we've been tracking here in Canada is certainly not unique to any one community. I want to throw that in. We see examples of the kind of hatred that you've seen on the screen behind us that has been carried out by people that may or may not be associated with any one community, from a whole range of political spectrums.
Well, let's zero in our next segment on anti-Semitism. You have the audit, the annual audit. Who's doing what, and has anti-Semitism changed in terms of violence, incidents, kind, in just a minute. We're going to be looking at the 2011 audit of anti-Semitism in Canada. Have there been changes? Have there been increases, decreases? Has it changed in terms of the kind of things, the incidents and crimes that have been perpetrated? Anita, this is 30 years, right? 30 years that B'nai Brith has been tracking.
The honest answer to that is B'nai Brith, which is an organization that's been in Canada since about 1875, has tracked it from day one, because anti-Semitism, of course, has been here from the first Jew that landed, and I don't doubt it'll continue, that we'll have a role to play for some time. But if the last 30 years, which happened to mark also the 30-year anniversary of the Charter, interestingly enough, for 30 years we've produced the formal report in the format that you've held up.
What are we looking at? What do we see?
Well, if we look at take a 30-year view, we see a steady move upwards in anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic incidents. This year we tracked, in the 12 months of 2011, we did track a slight decrease, but only slight, just under 1%, 0.7 for the accuracy. We break it down into 3 categories, just to give you a quick overview. And there's some movement up and down in the categories. Harassment, there was an overall decrease, small again, 5% over the previous years. But if you look at some regional pictures, it jumped in some regions, went down only marginally in some.
Where did it jump?
Well, we had a few provinces where you would think it'd be quiet, because the Jewish population is largely centered in Ontario and Quebec, but yet harassment is a factor in Jewish life everywhere. Vandalism, it actually jumped, and this is surprising perhaps, overall 14%.
Well, what do you mean by vandalism?
Well, let's
overturning gravestones and
yes,
swastikas?
we had a few gravestone incidents. If you recall, the year ended with a horrific series of graffiti appearing in one of the oldest cemeteries in Canada, actually in Victoria. But it's also graffiti on synagogues and so forth.
Have there been changes? over the years? What
well,
changes in
let me
kind?
just add one more category. Violence also did drop a bit, but it has by 20%, but there's an ongoing level. What's the changes? You know, I once said to a group, if you're expecting that that anti-Semitism is going to appear in the form of a guy with a black boots and a mustache, then you're missing what's going on in Canada. Before it would take a Zundel or a Keegstra to stand up on a soapbox and shout. Now they have different tools. So it changes in that way because it can spread like wildfire.
Give us an example of the changes.
Well, hate on the internet is a huge part of the story. You go onto any website, any social forum, and it doesn't take very long to find the comments. Any story that has to do with Jews in Canada, someone is posting something that's going to be anti-Semitic. So that's a big change. The tools of the hate monger, the ability, as they perceive it, to stay anonymous on the internet is a great tool. They don't have to risk being caught by a camera. And yet vandalism is up, where the cameras would more likely be placed. You know, someone said to me, well, you're tracking a graffiti in a washroom. Are you kidding me? How can you take that seriously? It's happening in the washroom because our camera systems are getting better, but we still don't put cameras in washrooms. So, you know, anonymity is still part of the picture. So the tools have changed, but the messaging has changed a lot. In that it's not necessary. It's not. Yes, we still see Holocaust denial. That was part of the problem, for instance, with the United Church report. It trivialized the Holocaust by the
saying
comparison.
The main problem with the Holocaust was the dignity.
That's right.
That
But
it was
likening the situation.
It was the death of the 6 million that was the bigger problem with the Holocaust. But Anita, I think that when you talk about the internet and the comments on the various sites, you find those same kinds of comments on mainstream newspaper sites when the articles have anything to do with finance, the economy. If you go to any daily newspaper site and you read an article on the economy, today's economy, what happened today with the Google shares or Apple shares.
So that's different.
And then you read the comments, and of course it's always there's always something about the Jews. If the stock market goes down, you will find in the comments some reference to the role the Jews played, whether it's George Soros or not George Soros. There's going to be an involvement of it's going to be brought in.
I think what Rochelle's right in saying, if I understand, that it's become socially almost acceptable to make comments that are just slightly on the intolerant range, and hoping that our tolerance for intolerance has broadened.
Has been blurred.
That's it. And I find it amongst the Jewish community. Someone will tell me 2 years later, oh yes, I remember seeing a swastika in such and such a location. Did you report it? No, because we've come to accept that we're going to see this kind of stuff around us, and we're not going to complain about everything.
So is that the message? We just have a few seconds about what to do, which is a program in itself.
Report.
And we have a 24-hour anti-hate hotline in which to do it.
Will you tell us the number?
It's 1-800-892-2624, 24
and where
hours
can
a day.
People get?
And they can visit our website to find out more details, which is www.b'nai-brith, all one word, .ca. All there, all the material.
Are we being quick, in a real quick end, are we being active enough as a Jewish community in following up and in proceeding? Are we letting it drop?
I think we have very good organizations that are there to step up, B'nai Brith being one of them, of course. We have amazing individuals that are monitoring, engaging, and speaking out. But overall, I worry about a level that we're accepting. I think we should have a zero tolerance, and somewhere it's crept up to something a little less.
So you say, report, talk.
Talk.
Don't be quiet.
Don't be quiet, and get involved. Become part of the solution. Don't just stand by and be a bystander. Really become part of the solution.
I thank you both very, very much. And remember to be a mensch.